thank you for being here. Can you hear me okay? You can hear me okay, yeah? I thought I'd sit further down here because being back up there is a little bit too formal and distant. And in fact, I think being here closer to you guys may help set the tone, because I like to discuss World War II with the audience. I like to take a lot of questions because I spent a lot of my life interviewing and being around World War II veterans, etc. It's been a long passion of mine. I would love to be able to answer any of your questions and interact with you as much as possible. First of all, I should say that, tell you a little bit about my background. I came to America almost 20 years ago. I met my wife in London, and we came, of all places, to San Francisco. So San Francisco was the first place, this area in general is the first place I lived in the US. When I came over, I didn't know I'd be here 20 years later talking to you guys after actually almost 2 decades of interviewing mostly American World War II veterans, which might seem odd as a Brit talking to you with this strange accent. My fascination with World War II is probably has the same source as other people in this room. My parents didn't serve in World War II, but both of my grandfathers did. My one grandfather was in the RAF in Egypt, and he ended up running the black market in Cairo and had a fantastic war. Sadly, couldn't bring back all his illicit earnings to Britain after the war, but he had a wonderful time. And I remember when I was a child in the 70s, he would always talk, whenever the war was talked about, whenever there was a film on TV, he was always very nostalgic. But I also remember seeing my mum's face when my grandfather would talk about World War II, and seeing my grandmother's face. And my grandmother's first husband was killed in World War II, and the guy that was the black marketeer was her second husband. So my mother was born a month after her father was killed. He was killed in the British Navy in 1942. He was on what were called the Malta runs. Malta was an island in the Mediterranean, as you all know, but it remained under British control. It was absolutely crucial that Malta not fall to the Germans. And the British Navy tried to supply Malta over a long period of time, and the convoys that went down from Britain to Malta were decimated. Very, very high numbers of casualties. My grandfather was a telegraphist, he was a local journalist and a telegraphist. His ship was sunk, he went into the water, he was pulled out of the water onto another boat, and that boat was sunk. And when that boat was sunk, he was severely injured. And because he was in the water for about 2 days, the injury became infected, and he got gangrene. And so they operated at the shin, the knee, and then the thigh, and anyway, he died. So, from my point of view, I grew up with a mother that never had a father, and I think it really profoundly affected my mother. She never got over that, and I always remember being affected by that, seeing my mum not having the father that she desperately wanted. When I was growing up, I was always aware of World War II. If you're British, you cannot escape the shadow of World War II. Even as someone who was born in 1966, I remember in the early 70s going to France for the first time with my dad, and we drove from the middle of England, where I lived, through the outskirts of London to cross the Channel. And I remember looking out the window and saying to my dad, well, what's that? What's that rubble there? What's that field of rubble there? And we were in the outskirts of London in the early 1970s, and they still hadn't repaired all the bomb damage from the Blitz from 1940. 30 years later. The first book I wrote about World War II, moving forward quite a bit, was about a photographer, a wonderful photographer, and I'm very happy to say that one of his finest images is right on the front of the Liberator. If you look at the book, now or later, it shows an image of a single soldier, and that's actually a Robert Capa photograph taken from July 1943. I wrote a book about Robert Capa. He was a Hungarian Jew, the greatest photojournalist, I believe, of the 20th century, certainly the greatest combat photographer of World War II. His images are the only images that you can find of D-Day on Omaha Beach. I think some of you would recognize those pictures of blurred soldiers walking, striding through the surf at 6:32 a.m. on Omaha Beach on D-Day. So when I was researching that book, I became very involved in talking to people who were photographers during World War II. People that had liberated the camps too, had taken photographs of the camps. People like Capa, who didn't go when he was asked at the end of the war to photograph the concentration camps or the death camps because he felt it was too personal. He couldn't face that yet. In fact, Robert Capa, as a Hungarian Jew, lost nearly all of his family. In The Envoy, a book I wrote before this one, I point out that almost 500,000 Hungarian Jews were killed in around 2 months in the summer of 1944. Some of them were Robert Capa's family. And he couldn't go back. He actually visited Auschwitz, but he didn't visit Auschwitz until 1947. It took him 2 years to be able to summon the strength, if you like, and the courage, although he wasn't a coward in any way, to go to the place where so many of his relatives had been killed. So I wanted to explain to you now why I wrote this book, The Liberator. And the book is intended as an homage to every infantryman, and particularly American infantrymen who served in World War II in Europe. I'm a European. I'm almost now an Anglo-American. I feel emotionally very torn between the two countries. My wife's American, my son's an American, and I still feel very, very British. I'm very proud of the country I came from. I'm not an economic immigrant. I came because my wife wanted to come and live here, and I came with her, and I therefore live here because I love it, but also I don't have to live here. This summer was a moment for me when I realised how strongly I felt about Americans in Europe in World War II. Having interviewed men who watched their brothers die on Omaha Beach, having interviewed many men who fought at the Battle of the Bulge, having interviewed Americans who fought in the Battle of Britain as RAF pilots. I've interviewed far more Americans about World War II than I have Brits. And this summer I took a tour group for the National World War II Museum. And the tour is called Victory in Europe. And we take people like yourselves from London all the way to Bremen, to when the Americans crossed the Rhine. And I found myself in a graveyard in the south of England in front of the grave of a guy called Billy Fisk. And Billy Fisk was the first American to die in air combat in World War II. He died on the 16th of August 1940, which is a long, long time before Pearl Harbor. But he also enjoys the distinction of being the greatest bobsledder who ever lived in America. He won the gold medal at age 16, and then he won it again when he was 20, and carried the Stars and Stripes at the, I think it's 1932 Winter Olympics at Lake Placid. And then he married an English girl, and went over when the war started and went and fought with the RAF in the 601 Squadron. And I had a group of people like yourselves, and we were in a very beautiful English graveyard, and on his headstone is written, "An American who died that England might live." And I found myself being very suddenly caught up in the emotion of this, and I said, the journey that you Americans are going to take with me in the next couple of weeks, and in a way the journey that the character of my book takes, no one in America in 1942, 43, 44 really believed that working class Americans dying in Europe were dying for Americans' freedom back home. We have to make that a very clear point. By 1944, when most Americans believed that Americans landed in Europe, i.e. on D-Day, there was absolutely no chance in hell that goose-stepping Nazis were going to come marching down the mall in America. The 153,000, and I'll say there's predominantly blue-collar Americans, died to liberate Europe. They did so at a time when everybody in America who knew what was really happening knew that that sacrifice was not going to preserve Americans' freedom, it was going to preserve Europeans' freedom. And I think this is a distinction that it takes a European to make. It's not one that you hear very often, but it's something that goes to the core of my work, of what I celebrate. I celebrate working class American warriors in Europe. When I was in Paris in August, you go to the Arc de Triomphe, you go to these beautiful places, and you think to yourself, there would be swastikas here still. There would be no trade unionists, left-wing trade unionists. There would be absolutely no Jews. But there would be no Jehovah's Witnesses. There would be no left-wingers. There would be no Democrats. There would be nobody that would put their hand up and say, I want to vote. Americans liberated France. The French like to think that the Second Armored Division under Leclerc was there too, and they were, but it was predominantly Americans who were responsible for the liberation of Paris, certainly. So I got to the point where I wanted to write about one American who would symbolize so many other Americans. And that man is a gentleman called Felix Sparks. And he is the subject of The Liberator. Felix Sparks, I came across his story in a remarkable way. I was researching Americans who had liberated the concentration camps. And I was fascinated by that story because I think that the Americans who did liberate those places were in some ways incredibly fortunate. In one way they were very unfortunate because they were traumatized by what they saw. As Felix Sparks said, what he saw robbed the human mind of reason. It sent many of his men crazy. In a very important, profound way, those Americans who liberated Buchenwald first and then Dachau, they saw why 153,000 Americans, and I'll say it honestly, had to die. What was that sacrifice for, apart from to liberate Europe? That sacrifice ultimately, in the end, was to stop the Holocaust, was to stop genocide, and was to stop the greatest evil we've known in modern times. So, in a sense, a liberator is someone who's blessed and cursed with knowledge and the experience of having seen why, but also being traumatized by the horrors of what they experienced. When I first came across with Felix Sparks, I came across him on the internet. I was researching liberators from World War II, and I saw an image that really haunted me, and I'll stand up to show you this. And what it shows is a 26-year-old working class guy from Arizona called Felix Sparks, who's a lieutenant colonel, and he started the war as a captain, landed in Sicily on the 10th of July 1943 with the 157th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry